Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants have been placed on a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I'd now like to turn the conference over to Kelly Holloway. You may begin.
Thank you, and on behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce's Trade Information Center, I appreciate very much all of our participants joining us today for our program on understanding export controls. This webinar is one of a series from the Basic Guide to Exporting program that's designed to help companies new to exporting or help train staff new to supporting export activities. You'll see the URL on the welcome slide here where you can find a schedule of programs. And do know that this series repeats in the fall. There will be new content added, so I encourage you to check back. I should also point out that our past programs as well as upcoming ones, our past programs here you'll see some listed above the archived webinar note. Those are all online and can be viewed, the presentations with audio, the whole bit. So if you've missed something in the past or there's a topic you want to be refreshed on, please check there. It's a great program, a great series, and it has an important objective, which is to better prepare American companies to export and export more. And we're supporting this program as part of the administration's National Export Initiative, which has the objective of doubling U.S. exports in 5 years, a very aggressive goal. An important part of that is getting the information into your hands so that you can better, more smoothly and seamlessly facilitate your export transactions. For this hour-long program, we're pleased to welcome Doug Bell, Export Counselor for the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Department of Commerce. Mr. Bell has been with BIS for more than 9 years, and he will admit to you that he's taken every question at least twice over, so give him your best shot today. Today he'll provide a basic level of understanding of the export licensing process. Otherwise, the terminology alone can be like a foreign language. And do know that BIS hosts a number of 2-day in-depth seminars around the country each year. So if this is something that you really need a depth of expertise on, do consider joining one of their seminars. And he'll be covering what kinds of products require a license, which government agencies have jurisdiction over what products, and a bit about the process of applying for an export license. And then after his remarks, you'll hear from Michael Zitnick, who is part of the compliance team at the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Controls. Michael's a member of the Sanctions Compliance and Evaluation team, and since 2006, he's worked in various capacities for OFAC, specializing in matters relating to international banking, trade finance, and money service businesses. He also has been involved in addressing compliance-related matters involving situations of kidnap and ransom. So maybe we'll get some good stories out of him as well. And prior to coming to OFAC, Michael worked on precedent-setting litigation arising from monopolization and merger disputes. And as you'll see here, he'll cover OFAC jurisdiction, sanctions programs, licensing application, compliance, and internal controls. Just a few housekeeping details to make sure you get the most of the program. If at any time you have any difficulties with your audio or other issues, press star 0 for operator assistance. The program, as I mentioned, is about 60 minutes long, and after the speaker remarks, we'll have an operator-facilitated question and answer session. But we also invite you at any time during the remarks to type in a question for the presenters, and you'll see at the top of your screen a Q&A feature. Simply click on that, and a pop-up box will happen, and you can type in your question, and we'll work to address those at the end during the open question and answer session. Note, too, that copies of these materials and a recording of today's program will be emailed to all registrants following the webinar. That'll happen later this week. And I just want to share with you briefly that the Trade Information Center is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're a clearinghouse of information supporting U.S. exporters worldwide, and we facilitate export education webinars such as this. Have an excellent website, export.gov, which is here. It's much larger than what you see. This is one screenshot. And important to note is the call center, 1-800-USA-TRADE. So 8 to 6 Eastern Time, you can speak with a trade specialist and start getting to the answers you need related to exporting. So let me now queue up Doug's presentation, Doug Bell with the Bureau of Industry and Security. Turn it over to you, Doug, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kelly, and good afternoon to you out there in the export community. I am Douglas Bell with the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, and today we are going to take a quick journey through some basic information about U.S. export controls under the Commerce Department's jurisdiction and regulations. So buckle up and hold on. First, do you need an export license for all of your export transactions? By and large, no. The vast majority of export transactions under commerce do not require a license, but we have to look at the details for the transaction before we can determine what the requirements are for your particular situation. The main purpose of our export controls is to serve national security issues and concerns. Also, we are interested in maintaining our foreign policy and our obligations under agreements we've made with other countries. And of course, weapons of mass destruction is always a big issue. So again, that would be the main purpose of our controls, and our export administration regulations are what give us the legal authority to implement these export restrictions and export controls. And our export administration regulations, commonly referred to as the EAR, apply to what's called a dual-use item. It sounds ominous, but in reality, it's simply any item that has not in any way been made to military specifications. That basically is a dual-use item. So as you look around the office or the location where you are currently, most of the items in that vicinity would be dual-use items. So it's not as ominous as it sounds, but our export administration regulations would cover dual-use items. And since there are so many items that have not been made to military specifications, we have a broad jurisdiction, but as we look at the details of the transaction, it's determined that a very, very small percentage of transactions subject to our jurisdiction will actually require the export license. So broad jurisdiction, very narrow focus. Our export administration regulations actually would extend to all items in the U.S., but also certain items located outside of the U.S. So when I mention all items in the U.S., if your item is being shipped from the U.S., even if the item was not manufactured in the U.S., that item, because it's now being shipped from the U.S., is subject to U.S. export laws and regulations. And the items outside of the U.S., again, if it was shipped from the U.S., no matter where the item lands, if it's at that point re-exported to another destination, another customer, another country, that also would be subject to U.S. re-export laws and regulations. We also have concerns about the activities of U.S. persons, so you can't facilitate weapons of mass destruction research and development without prior U.S. government authorization. And the last bulletin, it's really going to catch a lot of people off guard because in theory, you can kind of follow an export transaction. You physically see something leaving the U.S. heading to a destination outside of the U.S. With a deemed export, nothing leaves the country. The export takes place when a foreign national comes into the U.S. and gains access to controlled level technology or information within the U.S. So unfortunately, deemed export transactions are occurring on a daily basis, and a lot of the participants are not aware of that. So again, we treat the fact that the foreign national is here in the U.S. gaining access to this controlled technology as if you shipped that controlled technology to their home country. The Commerce Department, and in particular the Bureau of Industry and Security, does not work alone. We are not in a vacuum. There are other agencies involved with implementing U.S. export controls, and Michael will be more than happy to share with you guidance from the Department of Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control, but there's also the U.S. Department of State, and they would have jurisdiction over items made to military specifications, Department of Justice, Drug Enforcement, and the Department of Energy. So again, the Department of Commerce does not work alone in implementing U.S. export controls. Now, because we have to look at each transaction case by case, we must review the exact details of that situation before we can verify what the requirements are. And those details would start with, what exactly are you exporting? What is the item? What is the commodity? And when we identify the item, we also identify what's called an ECCN, and that is not one and the same. Again, that is not one and the same with the Schedule B or Harmonized Tariff Code. ECCN stands for Export Control Classification Number. All items that are subject to the Commerce Department's jurisdiction and under our regulations will have a corresponding ECCN, and that ECCN gives anyone involved with an export transaction a better understanding of the item's potential uses, capabilities, and technology level. With that information, then it is much easier to verify what, if any, concerns the U.S. government would have for this item to be sent to any customer in any location. So the first issue, what is your item? The second issue, where are you shipping? What's the actual country? But that's not enough, because we also need to know exactly who is going to receive the item. Who is the end user? That's important because here at the Commerce Department, as well as the other government agencies involved with export controls, there's a listing of individuals that have been caught violating U.S. export laws and regulations, and those individuals can no longer participate in international transactions. So it would be due diligence on the U.S. suppliers' part to make certain that they screen all of their customers against the various lists from the different government agencies to make sure they are shipping to a legitimate customer. And last but certainly not least, what exactly are they going to do with this item? What is the end use? So the item and its ECCN, destination, the actual customer, and end use. Those are the details that are reviewed on a case-by-case basis in order to verify what the requirements are for any and all transactions under the Commerce Department. The ECCN that I just mentioned, Export Control Classification Number, is going to be found within our Export Administration Regulations in Part 774, and that part is entitled the Commerce Control List. And the Commerce Control List is a compilation of all ECCNs, and that Commerce Control List is divided into 10 different categories, 0 through 9, and these categories roughly coincide with different industries, different manufacturers in the U.S. and around the world. So the higher levels of technology and capability will have a specific ECCN, and in appearance, the ECCN will always be 5 characters and alphanumeric. It'll start with a number. That number indicates the actual category. Then it's followed by a letter, which indicates the product grouping, if it's a finished product, if it's raw materials used to create or manufacture a product, if it's test and production equipment for that product, or if it's technology and software. That will be identified by the second character in the ECCN, which will always be a letter. And the last three characters will always be digits, and the third character is the key in those last three, because after the letter, that next character indicates what type of concerns the U.S. government has for the item and what type of controls are in place. So if your item is not rising to the level that generates an ECCN and it's a concern for, say, national security issues, then all of those other items will fall into what we call our basket designation, and that's EAR 99. An example of EAR 99 is pretty much everything you would see in an office environment. Telephone, desk, seating, furniture, all of that's EAR 99. Now, once you have that ECCN, again, it will let you know what the reasons for concern are for that item. And with that information, you would go to what's called the Commerce Country Chart, found in Part 738, Supplement Number 1. And if you'll notice, across the top of the chart are reasons for control, starting with chemical and biological weapons, nuclear nonproliferation, national security, etc. These are the same reasons for control that you'll see under an ECCN. Now, to the left of this chart in alphabetical order, you'll see the countries that we recognize around the world. So you identify your ECCN, you'll know which one of these controls apply to your item, you look for your country, and as you go across the chart, if there's an X under any of the reasons for control that you found under your ECCN, that means at that point the combination of your item and its potential uses going to that country raises enough concern to the U.S. government that an export license is required. So that's how that case-by-case scenario would work. Now, after identifying that there is an X under one of those reasons for control, that's not the end of the process, because, again, I had stated that the vast majority of the transactions under our regulations do not require an export license. That is because at this point I would like to introduce you to your newest and bestest friend within the export community, a license exception. A license exception will allow you to engage in this transaction that you've already identified as having high levels of technology that raise concern to the U.S. government being shipped to this country. As long as you meet the criteria and the requirements under a license exception, you may ship that item to that customer and that country immediately without going through the export license process. So that, again, is why the license exception will be an invaluable friend and ally in your export endeavors, because it will allow you to ship immediately without the delay of the export license process. Again, when identifying the actual recipient or the end user, you need to know who is involved and what they are doing with the item, because you do not want to inadvertently support any of these weapons of mass destruction projects, and you certainly do not want to ship to a denied person. The first three that you see here under the list to check, denied persons, entity list, and unverified list, comes directly from the Commerce Department. From our BIS website, we have links to all of these lists, but the first three are from the Commerce Department. The others are from the Department of State and the U.S. Department of Treasury. So you always want to make sure your customer is not on any of those lists, or follow the guidance that you see under the appropriate listing. And the reason that's important is, again, because the denied persons list in particular is a compilation of those who have been caught violating the regulations. If you don't ask the questions that may be generated from exchange of information, then you may find yourself involved in a transaction that's violating the regulations, and in that case, at that point, you may end up on the denied persons list. So What we provide as guidance is something called a red flag. And an example of that is, say you're shipping to a customer that's located in Sweden and they have requested that you provide the owner's manual in Russian. Well, that's odd because the last time we checked, Russian was not the national language of the country of Sweden. So that's an indication that that may not be the final destination for your item. So that's a red flag. You always want to look out for red flag and ask further questions anytime there is a red flag, because you do not want to self-blind. By self-blinding, you're ignoring some of the abnormal circumstances, and that may lead to a violation. So do not self-blind. Ask questions as a follow-up. And if you fail to do so, you're possibly looking at either civil or criminal sanctions and penalties. On the civil side, you'll get a fine possibly upwards of $250,000 per violation and denial of export privileges. If the violation rises to the level that it is treated under criminal penalties, then the fines are escalated up to 7 figures, and that's $1 million per violation. Also, you will be at no additional expense to yourself be provided with a new wardrobe, and that will be the color of orange every day for the next 3 to 5 years possibly. And oh yeah, by the way, you'll no longer be able to export. So if your company was created mainly for international transactions, you can see that could put a dent in your ability to operate your company. When it comes to actually shipping your item, you can do so under the Commerce Department in a couple of different ways. You may need an export license provided by the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, or again, you qualify for a particular license exception, in which case you can ship immediately without the delay, or based on a review of your details, you do not require an export license. So at that point, again, you ship immediately, but as opposed to a license exception, you ship under the authorization NLR, no license required. We here at BIS are glad to be a part of the outreach efforts in the National Export Initiative. Our information is available from the BIS website, www.bis.doc.gov. You can also call the office 202-482-4811 to receive one-on-one counseling. And the Export Administration regulations are available online as well. From that BIS website, we have brochures and publications, frequently asked questions, and we have recently opened a online training room where we have webinars and videos. So we are here. Anytime there's a question about your requirements under our regulations, don't hesitate to either go to our website, contact the office for that guidance, and here's the contact information for the Washington, D.C. headquarters, or the 202-482-4811 number that I mentioned that I would be available at, as well as the 2 locations in California. And as far as any questions on possible violations, we have an 800 number to the Office of Export Enforcement for their guidance. So, in summation, always plan ahead, because you want to make sure that your transaction does not require an export license, or if it does, you give yourself enough time to apply for that license. Because each application submitted to the Commerce Department is reviewed case by case, processing time will vary. So you don't want to delay your shipment and create bad blood with your customer. So again, plan ahead, know your ECCN, know where it's going, know who the recipient is, and what they're going to do with the item. If you have any questions, again, do not hesitate to consult with BIS.
Terrific, Doug. Thank you so much. This was very practical, straightforward, and easy to follow. A real help. And the phone numbers will be circulated to all participants for your easy follow-up as well. And of course, the Q&A session at the end, I want to encourage you and remind you that you can type in questions at any time, and then we'll have an open Q&A after Michael Zitnick's remarks with OFAC, and I'm pulling up his presentation now. I've already given your introduction, so please go ahead and get started, Michael.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, we'd just like to thank Kelly and the U.S. Commercial Service for allowing us to participate in today's webinar on understanding export controls. Again, my name is Michael Zitnick, and I'm with OFAC Sanctions Compliance and Evaluation Division. And today we'll be touching briefly on economic sanctions and export controls. Okay, so first question, who is OFAC? OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and we are within the U.S. Department of the Treasury. OFAC administers and enforces economic and trade sanctions against targeted foreign governments, individuals, entities, and practices. OFAC acts under presidential national emergency powers as well as authority granted by specific legislation to impose controls on transactions and freeze assets under U.S. jurisdiction. Many of the sanctions are based on United Nations and other international mandates, are multilateral in scope, and involve close cooperation with allied governments. Now, we just listened to Doug give a fantastic overview with respect to BIS regulation and export controls, and I think that this slide is quite helpful to kind of show some of the differences that exist between sanctions and export controls. With sanctions, we have a comprehensive use of U.S. economic force based on foreign policy goals. Sanctions block assets and restrict trade and financial transactions. Sanctions are used against specific targets and their agents. Primarily, OFAC expertise is financial, and with sanctions, jurisdiction is primarily limited to U.S. persons and citizens, whereas with export controls, the export controls control dissemination of dual-use products and technology to destinations and end users throughout the world. BIS expertise includes engineering and product knowledge used for product classification, and jurisdiction is U.S. persons as well as goods and technology. Now, I'd like to touch briefly on OFAC's jurisdiction. With respect to individuals, OFAC jurisdiction is limited to U.S. citizens and permanent resident aliens located anywhere in the world. And this would also include individuals, regardless of citizenship, physically located in the United States. Now, turning to corporations, OFAC jurisdiction is limited to corporations organized under U.S. law, including foreign branches of U.S. companies, and those corporations physically located in the United States, including U.S. branches, agencies, and representative offices of foreign corporations. Now, I will place one caveat here, is that under the Cuba program, in terms of corporations, would include U.S. subsidiaries. But for the other sanctions programs that are administered and enforced by the office, you really would just want to look at this slide right here in terms of our jurisdiction. And one quick note is that OFAC does operate under a clause of strict liability. So I mean, to the extent that you knew or did not know if the violation or apparent violation occurred, it certainly could be looking at potential enforcement action. And certainly we'll have a chance later on in this presentation to discuss the sort of enforcement aspects of OFAC as well as the development of a compliance program. Okay, now want to touch briefly on the various sanctions programs that are administered and enforced by the office. They can be broken down largely into three groups: comprehensive programs, limited programs, and list-based programs. Comprehensive programs include Sudan, Cuba, and Iran sanctions, and generally these sanctions are they generally prohibit trade-related transactions and can also include individuals and entities that appear on OFAC's SDN list, which we'll discuss shortly. In terms of limited programs, limited programs as administered by OFAC include Burma, diamond trading, North Korea, and Syria. These programs are not limited to individuals and entities that appear on OFAC's specially designated nationals list, but may also include additional controls such as a prohibition on importation of products. So, for example, in the Burma sanctions, generally speaking, it's prohibited for U.S. persons to import a product of Burmese origin. And then lastly, we have our list-based programs, which include which are activity and regime-based. So, for example, anti-terrorism, non-proliferation, counter-narcotics trafficking, and then a host of regime countries as well. So just to touch on this a bit more, in terms of the comprehensive programs, once again, imports and exports are generally prohibited. Now, OFAC has jurisdiction under Iran and Sudan to issue TISRA licenses, which we'll be discussing shortly. TISRA stands for Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. And these are generally licenses that U.S. exporters would apply to export agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical devices. And the Bureau of Industry and Security has jurisdiction over Cuba. Now, in terms of limited programs, the prohibitions do vary, as we were discussing earlier. They're not list-based entirely, and may impose certain restrictions that certainly are pertinent for exporters. So, as we were discussing earlier, imports of products of Burmese origin would be impermissible. Similarly speaking, for products that are from North Korea, that would also be impermissible for those to be imported into the U.S. The Syria program is another good example. Another good example of a limited sanction would be one in which a U.S. person would be prohibited from receiving a gift or donation from the government of Syria. Now, in terms of OFAC's list-based sanctions programs, regimes, we have Balkans, Belarus, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, Congo, Liberia, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, and Syria. Now, generally speaking, with respect to these programs, primarily the only concern is ensuring that you are not dealing with an individual or entity that appears on OFAC's list of specially designated nationals and blocked persons. And generally speaking, all transactions with specially designated nationals and blocked persons are prohibited. Now, I will tell you that with respect to the Libya program, it is a little bit broader. It is still list-based, but transactions with respect to the government of Libya, its agencies, instrumentalities, and controlled entities would be prohibited. So keep in mind that you won't necessarily see those all of the government of Libya's agencies, instrumentalities, and controlled entities appearing on the SDN list. But I think that one quick word of wisdom here is, to the extent that you have a transaction involving an OFAC sanctioned jurisdiction, whether it's primarily a list-based program or a comprehensive program, certainly don't hesitate to kind of put things on hold for a second. Certainly visit our website or give us a call at any time, and we'd be more than glad to discuss what the implications may be regarding the sanctions program. Now, in terms of activities, again, terrorism, weapons proliferation, and narcotics trafficking, with respect to these sanctioned activities, primarily you're looking at those persons that appear on the SDN list. Okay, now, this leads perfectly into sort of an overview of specially designated nationals. SDNs there are over 6,000 individuals and entities that have been identified by OFAC. And these are individuals, entities, vessels, banks who are owned, controlled by, or acting on behalf of targeted governments or groups. Now, the SDN list can be updated quite frequently, so I think it's always very important to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of the SDN list. And that is publicly available on our website, which we'll get into a bit later on in the presentation. One thing that I will say is that generally speaking, for those of you who may be a bit unfamiliar with the SDN list, while it does include a listing of of certain individuals and companies and vessels, generally speaking, along with a designation will be a whole host of other biographic information that can be used when reviewing a potential match. So to the extent that you have, let's say, for example, a John Smith who's attempting to do business with your firm, and let's just say for purposes of example, there's a John Smith that appears on the SDN list. Generally speaking, with that designation on the SDN list, John Smith's date of birth will be provided, his nationality, citizenship, address information, other biographic or government-issued identifiers such as passport information. To the extent that the individual is a U.S. person, you very well may find their Social Security number as well. And we do have steps available on our website as to how to best determine if a potential match is, in fact, a true match to the SDN list. And also we're also freely available on our compliance hotline. So to the extent that you have any questions with respect to potential SDN matches, please don't hesitate to give us a call. Now, applying for a specific license, as we were discussing with respect to our comprehensive programs a bit earlier, Iran and Sudan, we certainly have U.S. exporters have the ability to apply for TISRA licenses to export agricultural commodities, medicine, or medical devices to Iran or Sudan. And brand new, we have an online application system. Previously, U.S. exporters would have had to have put together a formal written letter to the office and submit that. But now we've really automated things, and you can go in and fill out the application online. And generally speaking, the application will request certain applicant information. The financial institutions that would be involved in processing the transaction, generally speaking, the reason why that's requested is that some of the financial institutions in Iran and Sudan have been specifically designated and appear on OFAC's SDN list. The application will also request the names of the brokers, purchasing agents, end users, and will request information as to the shipment terms and payment mechanism. Generally speaking, the reason why this information is requested in the application is A, to ensure that the U.S. exporter is not dealing with any individual that appears on OFAC's SDN list and is not attempting to engage in shipment terms or some form of a payment that would run afoul of our regulations. So I think of it more as a cross-check, and as always, we are more than glad to assist any exporter that has questions regarding TISRA licenses. We get calls quite frequently and can certainly work with you in putting together an application to the extent that you're looking to export product to Iran or Sudan.
Michael, can you speak up just a little bit? Some of the participants are having difficulty here.
Oh, absolutely. Hopefully that's a little bit better there.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Now, turning to enforcement, I just want to touch briefly on some frequent OFAC violations by exporters. We have, generally speaking, we have transactions that involve OFAC-sanctioned countries where there are comprehensive programs in place, such as Iran, Cuba, and Sudan. We have transactions involving SDNs directly or indirectly. So a good example here would be a U.S. exporter that, let's say, for example, sells product to a distributor in Europe, and that distributor in Europe, in turn, sends the product to an individual or entity appearing on OFAC's SDN list. I think that generally speaking, declaration control statements are a really good way to try and mitigate the potential of engaging in a transaction that would run afoul of the regulations, as well as discussing to the extent that you're onboarding a customer, who it is that they may be selling your product to ensure that those parties are not appearing on the SDN list. We also have unlicensed exports. It's a frequent OFAC violation. So this would be a U.S. exporter sending an agricultural commodity or medicine or medical device to Iran or Sudan, relying on an out-of-date SDN list. We see this quite frequently, where there may be a U.S. person or a firm operating that is using an SDN list that was published 2 or 3 months ago, and may not have necessarily seen that OFAC recently added the individual that they were exporting to the list. And then we have sort of this reliance on a freight forwarder, and this is, I want to say, really relying on any third party to the extent that you are, or the U.S. person is relying on a third party for compliance. It doesn't remove the responsibilities. So I think that that's one thing that we see, and I think that it's always best to ensure that to the extent that you're operating or engaging in transactions that may be sent to an OFAC sanctioned jurisdiction, that you certainly have a compliance program in place, and that you're not necessarily relying on a third party. Okay. Want to touch briefly on the penalties. These are the statutory maximums for civil violations. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which would apply to the Cuba program, it's $65,000 per apparent violation. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, this primarily applies to most of the sanctions programs that are administered and enforced by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. You're looking at a statutory maximum of $250,000 or twice the transaction value. Under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, the statutory maximum is a bit over $1 million, and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, the statutory maximum is $55,000. Now, what is it exactly? To the extent that OFAC is aware of an apparent violation by a U.S. person and is looking to take enforcement action, what is it that OFAC is taking into account? We're primarily taking into account characteristics of the violation and characteristics of the institution. So, for example, we're looking to see, was the violation or the apparent violation willful or reckless? Was there sanctions harm? The timing of the violation. Did this happen immediately following an update to the SDN list, or was the U.S. person dealing with a designated entity 2 years after they were added to the SDN list? Any remediation that may have taken place, and awareness of the conduct. Was this something that they did knowing that this could happen, or were they primarily unaware of the conduct that was taking place? So a good example here would be sending product to a third party, and that third party then exporting the product to either a sanctioned jurisdiction or an individual or entity appearing on the SDN list. In terms of characteristics of the institution, individual characteristics, is this a small exporter that's just starting to export, or is this a large commercial enterprise that has operations all over the world? Whether or not there's a compliance program in place, any cooperation with OFAC, previous enforcement actions, and certainly the future compliance and deterrent effect. And then there are also other relevant factors that could be taken into account. Now, I will say that there is a link down here, which I just went ahead and put a check mark next to it. Certainly, to the extent that you'd like to read our 2009 guidelines in more detail, please feel free to visit the link below. Okay, now, how is it that you stay out of harm's way and are not engaging in activities that would necessarily run afoul of OFAC's regulations? I just want to touch on developing a compliance program. There are really 5 main areas that you want to look into, and certainly to the extent that you have any additional questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and I'd be more than glad to follow up for anyone that's just starting to export. Or even if you've been exporting for some time and have further questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or give us a call on the hotline. It really starts with setting a responsible individual. So who is it that's going to take ownership and that's going to be responsible for the OFAC compliance program? From there, you'd want to really do a risk assessment. Some questions that you should be asking would include, one, am I exporting to an OFAC sanctioned jurisdiction already? Or are the parties that I'm doing business with, are they in turn dealing with individuals or entities that appear on OFAC's SDN list? From there, after completing your risk assessment, you'd want to move to look to your internal controls or due diligence. What is it that I can put into place that's going to mitigate the potential of our firm engaging in a transaction that runs afoul of the regulation? and then from there, testing those internal controls and those due diligence practices that have been put into place, and always recommend either an internal or external audit to assess how well the risk assessment, the internal controls, and the testing is really working. And then, of course, training. I think it's important that all staff that may have any interaction or any dealing in transactions relating to exports or understand OFAC regulations, or at least on a high level, have some basic knowledge of OFAC sanctions programs. Okay, now just touching briefly on the OFAC website, which is available at www.treasury.gov/OFAC. From there, if you select the Resource Center, which I'm going to go ahead and put a check right about that right now, from there, you'll see a list that will pull down, and if you select financial sanctions, the page that we've taken a snapshot of will appear before you. And there are three main links that I just want to draw your attention to. One would be the specially designated nationals list. The second would be OFAC recent actions. Any time that OFAC updates its SDN list or there are changes in OFAC sanctions programs, we will publish an OFAC recent action. And you can also subscribe to receive email updates of any OFAC recent actions that have taken place. And then to the left, you'll see a circle around the link titled All OFAC Sanctions Programs. As we were discussing earlier, the various sanctions programs that are administered and enforced by the office, this will allow you this link will direct you to the page where there's a listing of all OFAC sanctions programs, and we'll also give you some added background as well. Now, what's not pictured is also on our website. We have frequently asked questions. We have contact information, which I'll also be providing shortly, and industry guidance that's tailored for specific industries. So, for example, we do have industry guidance tailored for the securities industries, exporters, money service businesses, and certainly please feel free to go ahead and pull those and take a read through. And then we also have reporting and licensing forms. So to the extent that you're looking to engage in a TIS-related export, or you've possibly had funds that have been blocked because they've been sent to an individual or entity appearing on OFAC's SDN list, forms are available on our website to submit specific license applications. And lastly, I just want to go ahead and provide our contact information here. There's our local and toll-free hotline numbers for OFAC's compliance division. If you have any questions at all pertaining to U.S. sanctions programs, please don't hesitate to give us a call at any time. And then also my email is also below. And to the extent that you have submitted a license application and have questions regarding that license application, we have the direct number for OFAC's licensing division here as well. And with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking everyone for allowing me to participate today, and I'd like to go ahead and turn it back over to Kelly.
Good, thank you. Good overview, some helpful food for thought. I'm sure many of our participants are asking themselves if they're checking all the right lists, if they are indeed in compliance, and what internal processes they have involved. I'm going to ask the operator to invite the participants now to ask their questions. Operator?
Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. Please ensure your line is unmuted and record your first and last name clearly when prompted. To withdraw a request, you may press star followed by 2. Once again, that is star 1 to ask a question, please.
Thank you. While we're waiting for the first question to come in, a question for you, Michael, and one of the participants is asking for clarification on what a clause of strict liability means. If you could explain that a bit.
Sure. I would certainly say that, to the extent that whether or not that there's knowledge, to the extent that the apparent violation has taken place, there certainly is the possibility for OFAC enforcement action. So for example, let's say, for example, that a U.S. exporter decides that that they're not aware of the sanctions programs that are in place with respect to Iran, and sends I don't know, 4 pallets of computers over to Iran, and again, keeping in mind that there is a prohibition on exportation or re-exportation of goods, services, or technology to Iran or the government of Iran. Whether or not the exporter had knowledge of that taking place, they could be held responsible for those actions.
Thank you. Operator, are there questions in the queue?
I'm currently showing no questions.
Okay. Well, let me throw out one to Doug then, because this comes to our attention at the Trade Information Center from time to time. And it is about trade shows, participating in trade shows. If a company has a commodity that does require, has an ECC in, does require an export license, are they able to send it to a trade show?
Certainly, and that's again why I introduced the export community to license exceptions. We do have license exceptions that are tailored for trade show participation, and in particular, license exception TMP. The basic theory behind a trade show is you're not exporting the item, though it does leave the U.S. It's leaving on a temporary basis to be exhibited at a particular trade show for a particular audience, and once that exhibit is completed, then either you move on to the next series of exhibitions or the item comes back to the U.S. In any event, because it's temporary, the item cannot remain outside of the U.S. for more than 1 year, and it cannot be in one location for more than 120 consecutive days. So as you are aware, or as you may imagine, going to the different trade shows, you're generally there a week, maybe 2 weeks, at most a month. After that, it's time to pack up and move on to the next location. So this license exception, TMP, short for temporary, will allow you to participate in trade shows with your item so it can be displayed and attract potential new customers without the need of the export license. Now, having said that, once it's on display and you get some interest, the item cannot be sold on the spot to that customer because, again, it requires an export license.
Good clarification. What's the lead time in terms of approaching BIS and applying for that to when it's actually issued?
Applying for an export license?
No.
Or the license exception?
Exception, so that goods can go to a trade show.
Okay. I'm glad you asked that because apparently I was not clear enough in my presentation. You do not have to apply for an export license, for a license exception. You apply for the export license. So once you've gone through the steps of identifying what you're shipping, where it's going, and if there are concerns by the U.S. government, when you know you need an export license, at that point you review the license exceptions. All of the license exceptions are found in Part 740. If you meet the criteria stated under a license exception, and we can go back to the example I just used, TMP, temporary, the item is a high level of capability and technology, but it's only going out of the country for display. It's not being sold. It's coming back after the exhibition is over. So if you meet that criteria, you can ship immediately because you are authorized to use license exception TMT. So there is no application required for the license exception. The application is only for the export license.
Good. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Let's go back over to OFAC for a second. The SDN list is very large. A good practical question from a participant: is there any easy way to check it? What is the most efficient, expeditious way to check the SDN list?
Absolutely. I want to say that with respect to the SDN list, we publish it in a variety of formats. On the web, you can pull open the SDN list in PDF or text format. We also have it in a variety of fixed width and delimited formats, so to the extent that you want to develop a program to screen. But certainly, a very easy way is to open the SDN list in PDF or text format and use the built-in search feature that's built either within the Acrobat Reader or within your browser to screen through the SDN list. One other thing that I will tell you is that now, while the Treasury doesn't endorse these public websites, there are a number of sites online that, to the extent that you run a simple web search for OFAC search or SDN search, you'll find some free websites that may be available that certainly would allow you to quickly check against the SDN list. But do keep in mind that you want to always ensure that the site is using the most up-to-date version of the SDN list.
And are there software packages and programs, if it's a large company that does a lot of exporting, they really need to step up their compliance?
Absolutely, yes. There are a number of vendors out there that do offer commercial software packages that would screen against not only those individuals and entities that appear on OFAC's SDN list, but would also look to OFAC sanctioned jurisdictions.
Thanks. Another question for you, Michael, is I'll just read this. Will OFAC consider a foreign subsidiary separately incorporated as a U.S. person if certain factors are present, such as a U.S. person is on the board or they share an IT platform?
I'd say that generally speaking, if those factors are present, I'm going to focus on the U.S. person on the board. The foreign subsidiary, and again, we're going to take this outside of the Cuba program because the Cuba program would apply to foreign subs. But let's say, for example, under Iran, we wouldn't necessarily say that the foreign subsidiary would fall under U.S. jurisdiction, but the U.S. person, that director or officer, certainly to the extent that individual was facilitating or engaging in transactions, that they could be held personally responsible to the extent that there was an apparent violation of the program.
Thank you. Operator, are there any questions in the queue?
Yes, I do have a question from Charlie. Your line is now open.
Yes, I had a question on what impact the President's initiative to have a single list that includes all these different restrictions is going to impact on the commerce list.
It's going to have a significant impact when and if all parties can agree on the format of that singular list. Right now, it's an undertaking that's ongoing as we speak, but we are not near completion of combining all of the items under the U.S. Department of State with all of the items under the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's an effort that's Herculean in nature, and it's quite a challenge, we found. But that is the goal, and right now we're trying to start with just a small percentage of navigation equipment just to get the ball rolling. So that's where we are now, and we are nowhere near having one control list for all items under the U.S. government's jurisdiction.
Thank you for that question. Operator, are there other questions in the queue?
I show no further questions.
There's a question that's come in that is quite specific, and in general, for specific products, I would encourage you to contact BIS directly or OFAC as appropriate, but as it may apply to several others. A question has come in about articles that are manufactured to military specifications and clarifying whether it's subject to ITAR or BIS jurisdiction. And an example would be O-rings that are purchased by commercial airlines.
If the item is not in any way made to military specifications, that is the quintessential dual-use item. It's under the Commerce Department regulations subject to the EAR. If the item is made in any way to military specifications or you're not sure, at that point you contact the U.S. Department of State because the item may be under the ITAR. So the item will not be under both Commerce and the U.S. Department of State.
Okay. Good, thank you. Diamond trading. What are the prohibitions for diamond trading, Michael?
Okay, great question. generally speaking, the prohibition pertaining to diamond trading would be one where there's a prohibition on the importation into or the exportation from the United States of any rough diamond from whatever source, unless the rough diamond has been controlled through the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme.
Okay, hopefully that'll be enough for the participant. And if not, again, Michael has generously offered to follow up with any questions you may have. I'm showing that we're at a minute past the hour. Operator, are there any more questions in the queue?
I'm showing no questions.
Okay. I'm going to then read one other that came in, typed in, and we'll remind the participants that we'll provide you with a recording of the presentation of the program and the presentation materials following the event later this week. And so this last question is saying that I've seen NLR and EAR entered on an EEI, so related to some of the documentation for the export. Is there a difference between these designations when entering it on the EEI? Is that something you would know, Doug?
Yes, and actually, Kelly, before I jump into this nice bowl of alphabet soup, NLR, EAR, EEI, the distinctions are simply NLR is the export authorization by the U.S. government. You can ship this item with no license required, NLR. EAR 99 identifies the item's potential uses, capabilities, and technology level. So they are not one and the same. And yes, they are often used in conjunction with one another, because when you're exporting EAR 99 items, or items that are either consumer type products or operating at the low end of a particular industry, there is no concern by the U.S. government for this item and its potential uses. The concern would be whether it's been sent to an embargoed country, sent to an end user involved with weapons of mass destruction research and development, or being sent to a denied party. So that's the distinction. NLR is your official authorization to ship, and EAR 99 would be the indication that your item is a very low level of capability or technology and or a consumer product.
An important distinction. Thank you. I'd like to invite Doug and Michael to make any last comments or important messages that you would like to leave with our participants.
Certainly. You want to start this off, Michael?
Sure. Just
okay.
to I guess close out the call, I would say that please, we know that certainly questions can come up pertaining to OFAC's regulations, and do not hesitate to give us a call. We're certainly here and really glad to help in walking through even the most complex fact patterns that you want to present, and certainly would provide guidance as to how to move forward on any transaction where there's a question on sanctions programs.
Okay, and I would like to at this point thank Kelly and also Michael for participating in this webinar. And as Michael has pointed out, we here representing the U.S. government, we want to assist you in any way we can. We have our contact information available online and direct contact through email to ourselves. And anytime anyone has a question on their requirements under the Export Administration regulations, please do not hesitate to contact the Commerce Department, either going directly to our website or making use of email and phone number information, so we can address those issues and we can get these exports flowing again.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise with all of our participants and your generous offer to help them individually should they contact your respective organizations. And on behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Trade Information Center, thank you to all our participants. We look forward to seeing you on a future Basic Guide to Exporting webinar. Have a good day.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.